Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening to everyone. My name is Tanzil Chowdhury, and I'm a lecturer here at the School of Law at Queen Mary, University of London. Welcome to the third event in our Law and Marxism series. And we have another fantastic book discussion today of Dr. Dina Tzouvala's Capitalism as Civilisation, with two equally brilliant discussants, Doctors Lucia Pradella and Robert Knox. Before we begin, as a centre, we'd like to offer our solidarity to Palestinians in all of historic Palestine and their diaspora who are currently facing an onslaught and intensification of settler colonial violence. As many of you may know, Palestinians have called for a general strike today, and we can support that not only by vocalising our support for the strike, but also, like we did with South Africa, support the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment and sanctions. So this series is hosted by the Power and Capital stream at the Centre for Law and Society in a Global Context. In our last event, we mentioned some of the reasons we had launched this series, and you can hear about them at the start of our inaugural book discussion, the video of which is on the first link that I've just sent out. However, it's briefly recapping on some of the objectives of this series, which I'm co-producing with another of our co-directors, Dr. Evan Anopoulos. So the objectives are still a work in progress for the Law and Marxism series, but we are thinking about the kind of interventions which are useful. So we're genuinely eager to hear from staff, students, activists about their thoughts in the creation and the curation of this series. But some of the ideas that we have in mind is trying to reach out beyond academia and beyond the Anglo-American tradition and to bring in people whose work has less visibility. We also want to bring together different disciplinary traditions in our discussion of Marxist legal theory. So what do non-lawyers have to say about the topic, of which today is going to be an especially brilliant illustration of that. We also want to link it to some of the work that we do in the other streams in the Centre for Law and Society Global Context, particularly with law, art and aesthetics, and what the aesthetics of a Marxist legal theory might look like. And also we want to look at what this series might mean for political struggle and political education beyond the academy, if that is even possible. I'm now going to hand it over to Isabel, another one of our centre's co-directors, who will be chairing proceedings for today.
Thanks, Tanzil. Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many people here, nearly 100 people, and I'm not surprised you've turned up because Dina Tzouvala's book, Capitalism as Civilisation, which we're going to talk about today, is certainly worth the time and worth the attention of our two also fantastic commentators. We're going to hear from Rob Knox and Lucia Pradella. And as Ava and Tanzil says, this is about not just having international law perspectives, but Lucia, of course, brings a political economy perspective. So I won't blabber on for too long. I'll introduce the speakers, and then Dina will talk about her book for about 20 minutes, followed by comments from first Rob, and then Lucia, and then Dina, if she wants to, has a right of reply before we open it up to questions from all of you. So do please, be thinking about lots of things to ask our commentators and of course Dina. So I'll start with Rob. Rob Knox, who I've known, we were just saying, for an awfully long time. And yes, as PhD students a long time ago, Rob is now a senior lecturer in the Department of Law at the University of Liverpool. He writes on social justice, on colonialism and imperialism, He's on the editorial board of Historical Materialism. I see from his website, his university website, which are always fantastically unreliable sources, that he's in the process of co-authoring a book that's forthcoming with called Against International Law. Once, yeah, fantastically. Mine is also very out of date. And then our second speaker is Dr. Lucia Pradella, who's also a senior lecturer in international political economy at King's London. She's also written for many non-academic publications, including The Guardian and Jacobin magazine. She's the co-editor of the Handbook of Marxism and Post-Marxism, and the author of Globalization and the Critique of Political Economy. Last but not least, of course, is our fantastic author, Dina Zavala today. She's a senior lecturer at the College of Law at the Australian National University. She's a senior advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. She's a member of the Twale Review Editorial Collective. She's the author of many wonderful publications, including recent journal articles, including The Spectre of Eurocentrism in International Legal History in the Yale Journal of Law and the Humanities, which I'm very much looking forward to reading, Dina. It's on my reading list. She's the co-editor of Revolutions in International Law, The Legacies of 1917, and a co-editor also of The Extraterritoriality of Law, History, Theory and Politics, and of course, the author of Capitalism as Civilisation, A History of International Law, which is what we're going to hear about today. So without further ado, Dina, please go ahead and introduce your book.
Hi everyone. Before I get started, I really want to thank Isabel for this very kind and generous introduction, and also Tanzil and Eva for organizing this, for bringing this, and organizing not only this book launch, but the whole series. I think it's fantastic. And of course, Rob and Lucia for their time and the generosity and the fact that they agreed to do that, even though everyone is so zoomed out. I'm extremely grateful, and I'm extremely grateful to anyone who turned up today. Before I get I share my screen and get started, I also want to acknowledge that today I'm zooming in from Canberra, which has been for 1,000 years the country of the Ngaurugal and Ngambri people, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I also want to acknowledge that sovereignty over these lands has never been lawfully ceded, and this remains Indigenous land. On that note, I'm really sorry if you have seen this presentation before, but what on earth are you doing here if you have seen this presentation before? This is really on you, not on me. I'm going to say some really brief things about the book, and I'm mostly going to focus on the overwhelming argument and the intervention, and I will not talk so much about individual chapters. If you have questions, please feel free to raise them after we are done. So assuming, just to establish, the minimum common denominator for the discussion, my book deals with the standard of civilization, and I'm trying, of course, to push back against, at a very basic level, against the standard narrative that you will find, in the international law textbooks and in the national law lectures, which is roughly that this has been an important but parochial standard, especially since 1945. So basically the narrative goes, the standard of civilization was important in international law, but after 1945, international lawyers discovered that they shouldn't be racists anymore, and they stopped doing that. And what I find really interesting, because I'm also very interested in what it means to be doing law, and especially in reading as a legal practice, what I find really interested in that is this narrative obviously faces some considerable problems, including at the very obvious level, Article 38 of the ICJ statute, right, that enumerates the sources of international law, amongst which, of course, is the general principles of law as found in the legal systems of civilized nations. And usually that causes a little bit of panic and discomfort. And usually the most common instruction, at least I have come up with, is to read it out, to read Article 38 as if it refers to all states and not to civilized states. And I think that's extremely interesting, the fact that we are directed to misread international law. Of course, not everyone, I'm not the first one to say that this doesn't sound particularly true. Amongst heterodox critiques is, of course, Tony Anghie's Imperialism, Sovereignty, and the Making of International Law, in which Anghie claimed that civilization has been and remains nothing else but yet another expression of the so-called dynamics of difference in international law. So writing in a very traditional post-colonial theory milieu, Anghie argued that what international law does is to constantly create others and to also come up with techniques to bridge this gap between self and other. And this is, at a very basic level, this is a persuasive argument, but I have some asterisks that I'm going to discuss in a moment. In this book, I have argued that we shouldn't approach civilization as a unitary concept that avails itself to some sort of unit of like conclusive definitions. Why? Well, because to begin with, at a very basic level, I don't think that lawyers are in the business of like defining concepts. Even when lawyers look like they're defining concepts, in reality, they're making arguments and they're assigning particular legal consequences to particular definitions. Definitions are almost instrumental or almost incidental to the legal consequence. For that reason, I'm arguing that we should understand civilization as a style or form of arguing about the distribution of rights and duties in international law. And this is a pretty handy thing to do for a number of reasons, including the fact that it makes the decline of explicit usages of the word and its derivatives not as conclusive, right? Because it's true, if you look at international law, maybe not after 1945, but definitely after the 60s or the 70s, the explicit usages of the word have been in steep decline. And if you start treating it like a concept, this presents a problem. I think this presents much less of a problem if you treat it as a style of argument that may be encapsulated by the word civilization and its derivatives, but it may well not. What type of argument is this? So I'm arguing that this has been a type of argument that is both bifurcated and internally and discursively unstable. And it is so because it oscillates constantly between two poles. I call the one the logic of improvement, and I call the other the logic of biology. The logic of improvement promises to non-Western, non-white majority, especially political communities, equal rights and duties in international law, conditional upon basically the political, legal, institutional, the adoption of the political, legal, institutional, and even aesthetic markers of capitalist modernity. So things like legalization of social and international affairs, especially the adoption of private law. Like if I wanted to be a very simplistic Marxist, I would say that civilization is property and contract, and you wouldn't be that far off. It's adoption of state centralization, territorialization of political authority, bureaucratization, and so on and so forth. So that's the logic of improvement. On the other hand, and at the same time, another logic has been in operation, and that is the logic of biology, which constantly defers this promise of equal inclusion based on ideas of immutable difference. And these ideas of immutable difference can and historically have been expressed in different registers or through different idioms. The most obvious and most persistent one is probably the idiom of race, right? But it's not the only one. It has also historically been the idiom of sex, understood as binary, stable, and biological, in which some political communities cannot possibly have equal rights and duties, either because they're feminine or because they're hyper-masculine. And it has also historically been expressed through the idiom of childhood, that certain political communities are children. They are not physiologically and mentally developed yet, and need to be guided to full maturity. And I happen to know that Rob has a forthcoming piece on Haiti, in which partly he describes the way the US related to Haiti as a older brother, younger brother sort of situation, which is exactly what I'm talking about here. So this is the bifurcation. How about the instability, the internal or discursive instability? So basically my argument, and that is, and that's perhaps one of the few things I ever disagree with Rob, this is perhaps the most Derridian part of the book, which is, well, the problem with these binaries is the more you look at the more you look at them, the more they tend to collapse into each other because they depend on each other to basically create meaning. So what appears to be capitalist modernity, if you actually scratch a little bit underneath the surface, turns out to be the culturally and historically specific manifestations of political power in Western Europe, or of political power of people who came to understand themselves as white. And this also works the other way around. Things that look like they have to do with immutable difference and race, actually, if you, or race or gender or childhood, if you scratch a little bit the surface, they actually turn out to be the preconditions of particular forms of capitalist modernity. And the example I use, for example, is racialized chattel slavery in the US, right? So for those who might not know, 19th century international lawyers were very jumpy about slavery. If you practice slavery, you were not civilized. They were surprisingly relaxed about slavery in the United States and also in colonies. But like before the US Civil War, no international lawyer that I know or I managed to find ever claimed that the United States was not a civilized state because the South was still practicing slavery. Nobody was saying that. And of course, one way to read this would be, of course, because this was racialized chattel slavery and it was okay basically for white people to enslave black people. That's one way to read it. But of course, the other way to read it is that this was not a pre-capitalist or non-capitalist form of slavery. This was a form of slavery that was actually profound. It was at the center of transatlantic capitalism, right? That it was tolerated because it was a form of capitalist or integrated within capitalism, slavery. So basically my argument is these two things, these two logics that look like the exact opposite of each other, if you start interrogating them a little bit, they start collapsing into each other. Improvement becomes biology, biology becomes improvement. Also, I'm saying that they collapse into each other in a different way, which is the question of the only interesting doctrinal legal question, which is who decides. So basically, the logic of improvement, by definition, includes the logic of biology, because even though it promises a horizon of equal inclusion, at the present moment, certain actors assert authority to unilaterally impose and assess certain criteria for civilized existence, which only makes any sense if you assume some form of superiority. Right? How did I get there? I got there through a weird and convoluted way, but basically the way I got there into this argument was the following. After I finished my PhD, and my PhD was a much more traditional, almost like Marxist hermeneutics. So I was like, civilization literally meant capitalism. There's nothing else to see here. So I wasn't talking about indeterminacy or any of that. So basically, after I finished the PhD, I reread From Apology to Utopia, and I realized that I didn't have a very good argument against it, which left me with two options, which was either to stop being a Marxist or to find a way to be a Marxist while holding on to the idea of structured indeterminacy. And I went for the second. And the second was not necessarily an obvious path, because I would say not all Marxist international lawyers, but certainly some, including Buttigieg Chimney and Rose Parfit, have actually accused Marta Koskieniemi and other basically creeds that the idea of indeterminacy makes it impossible to critique law's complicity with domination and exploitation. So basically, how can you say that law does things in the world if law is indeterminate? My counter argument to that is that basically the problem with indeterminacy in international law is not indeterminacy as such, is the conclusions that were drawn from the indeterminacy thesis, and especially the turn to charismatic authority of the individual lawyer, heralded, of course, by the gentle civilizer of nations. I'm instead saying that one way perhaps, or at least the way I found to be intellectually defensible, one way of critiquing international law is by accepting that international law is indeterminate, but trying to find its bias, trying to find the pro-capitalist bias of international law in the specific and concrete ways in which it is indeterminate. Of course, by the way, I'm talking about structured indeterminacy. If we are talking about unstructured indeterminacy, this argument doesn't work at all. And I'm saying in the book that basically these polls I just present to you, these logics I just presented to you, express in however heavily mediated way a very basic reality about global capitalism that tends to do things at the same time, and at the same time is the operative term here. First, it tends to expand limitlessly in order to overcome all borders and limits in ways that homogenize space, law, culture, political communities, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, this expansion happens in profoundly uneven ways, thereby creating fragmentation, divergence, unequal development, stratification, you can call it in different schools and in different disciplines, you can call it different things. And in a sense, my argument is this constant oscillation between improvement and biology reflects without being able to resolve, and hence why the oscillation continues to no end, this very basic contradiction at the heart of global capitalism. And then, very, very quickly, I'm just going to give people a sense of the way I do this. I have a first chapter, which is about method and theory, which is basically what I just summarized. And then I try to substantiate my argument in 4 historical chapters and move in a pretty basic and linear chronological way. Chapter 2 deals with the 19th century and especially with the so-called unequal treaties and extraterritoriality. And I try to map the debates around the abolition of extraterritoriality and show that basically this oscillation I just described was really obviously at play there. Then I move on to the League of Nations and especially to the mandate system, and I'm particularly interested in the emancipation of Iraq. Iraq was the only mandate that gained its independence under the League of Nations, so while the League was still alive. And I mapped the debates that happened in the Permanent Mandates Commission, and I tried to show that even though already since the interwar period, the explicit language of civilization was in decline, this oscillation existed, of course, with important variations, and the variations, of course, hinge on the evolution of what it meant to be a capitalist state. Fourth chapter or third substantive chapter, I deal with the Southwest Africa saga in front of the International Court of Justice. And I basically map the fact that the lawyers of Ethiopia tried to use the standard of civilization against the great. So they tried to basically say that the particular form of racial capitalism imposed upon Southwest Africa by South Africa was a violation of the sacred trust of civilization. But because of these oscillations and instability of the argument, they got trapped in a sense in their own argumentation. And my argument there is that basically the case of Southwest Africa as a radical case in international law had been lost actually a couple of years before the 1966 bizarro decision of the ICJ. And finally, I look at contemporary international law and especially the war on terror, and I map the survival of the standard of civilization in two distinct but interrelated fields in the war on terror. The laws of occupation in relationship to the occupation of Iraq after 2003. And I'm also looking at the so-called unwilling or unable doctrine in jus ad bellum, where I tried to show, again, the persistence of this type of argumentation, despite the fact that you can't really say civilization in polite company anymore. I think that was it from me, and I'm looking forward to your questions. And to Lucia's and Rob's comments, of course.
Thanks, Dina. Rob, go ahead.
Okay, right into it. Okay, so as some of you will know, Dina and I are good friends and comrades and collaborators, so it's quite difficult to come up with sufficiently critical comments that I don't ruin our relationship forever, but also sufficiently not praiseworthy comments so that everyone's just so bored that they want to leave. So I will just, I will go from there. And if any of this sounds agonized and strained, that's why. So I think it goes without saying, as everyone can see from all of the different events that have happened with this and enthusiasm for it, that this is obviously a really important book. And I think it's really significant. And I think it is worth, before pausing to talk about some of the ways that I would negotiate this book, the two of the really big achievements that I think are there, and Dina's already mentioned these, but obviously she's not going to big herself up as much as she should, because that would be bad. So I think the first obvious point that's really important in this book is that it systematically tracks and maps the importance of civilization across a range of different historical moments and contexts. And that's important, but it's also a thing that has been, as Dina acknowledges, done before. But what I think is really crucial then about this, and why I think the book is obviously worth reading again and again and again, is because of the particular materialist spin that she gives it, and in specifically this idea about the oscillation between the logic of improvement and the logic of biology, and that relationship to capitalist contradictions. I think this is a really important thing, and you cannot downplay the degree to which this is an important intervention in a bunch of fields, which I'll come back to. I think the other thing, and this is very important, and Dina's again alluded to this, is the kind of subtle but important methodological and theoretical intervention that's made here, particularly on this question of the relationship between contingency and structure, and contingency and necessity, which segues into the debates on indeterminacy, but I think is broader than that, and also something that Dina didn't pick up on in the talk, but is a certain kind of hidden Althusserianism, which is the spectre that haunts Dina all the time. And this idea of the particular mode of reading that international law represents, and a kind of particular symptomatic reading that she sets up as her method. And these two things mean that the book is really intervening crucially in a number of important debates, which, just for interest's sake, I will map up. So firstly, those are debates within international law, and specifically an intervention into something like CLS, and this language of indeterminacy, where I think Dina has done an excellent job in pushing back against what I think of as a certain kind of overly contingent reading of the indeterminacy thesis, which actually, if you look back at the beginnings of the indeterminacy thesis, really isn't warranted. If you look at the kind of beginnings of the indeterminacy thesis in the American legal realists, and then in Duncan Kennedy's articulation, the kind of approach that Dina is pushing here is how indeterminacy debates started off. The kind of nihilistic super contingency thing is a later addition to how people think about indeterminacy, which, if we were going to be vulgar Marxists, which I am, we can link to various conjunctures of material conditions about the particular decomposition of the academy, political debates by movements associated with materialism, and the kind of rise of neoliberalism and neoliberal subjectivity. So I think that's a really important intervention. The second important intervention, right, is this intervention into Tzouvala. And, you know, like, both Dina and I think, have a lot of respect and time for Tzouvala, but understand that it's a very Catholic, broad church with different methodological positions. And Dina's rigor in linking the kind of thinking about a dynamic of difference back to the kind of contradictions of capitalism is really important, I think, and is also one reason why I think Dina and I are very close intellectually, because it's always something I've tried to do, and her work is inspirational to that. I think it's also worth flagging up that this is also an important intervention into the Marxist tradition, and particularly into Marxist thinking about international law. And that's firstly insofar as it's trying to flag up again this importance of race, racialization, and those logics within the kind of broader construction of capitalism, which I think is really central. And also because of this insistence on the importance of textuality and of reading and of recovering certain lost resources, which I think is crucial. So with that stuff in mind, what are some of my slight disagreements, I guess? Well, I think one reason why Dina and I can often write together is that we essentially suspend certain big disagreements we have in the name of peace and in the name of being able to write. And those are largely not in play in the book, but I think they do come up in certain ways, which prompt me to just ask a couple of questions. And these questions are in a sense turning on that Derrida issue. That's the other spectre haunting this, but also on the issue of Pashikanis. Now, Pashikanis is not like a huge figure in Dina's book. It was a bigger thing in the PhD, I think, in some respects. But then Dina basically realized that even though she didn't like Pashikanis, she liked everyone that used Pashikanis, and she had to deal with that contradiction. And so one of the things that comes up in the context of this book is how that stands in terms of Dina's writing of the book. And one thing I want us to think about, right, is that just as Dina identifies this logic of improvement and this logic of biology, arguably in Dina's book, we could have what's called, I don't know, a logic of modesty and a logic of totalization, which kind of go back and forth with each other and to some degree structure her kind of methodological approach. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is one of the things that happens in a couple of the sides in the book is that Dina makes her disagreement with Pashikanians clear. And of course, I disagree with the disagreements. We don't need to go into those details. But importantly, what Dina is trying to draw out of those disagreements is a sense of her own methodological position. And a big part of what is happening in the book, alongside everything else, is an attempt to stake out a particular mode of reading, which is opposed to things which Dina sees as overly large and systemic or systematic claims about law, its nature, and the relationship to capitalism. So this is, I think, where what I would say the logic of modesty comes in, right? So there are certain points where Dina, I'll just quote, "I did not produce a theory of international law as a whole. Mine is a finite peer about one pattern of argumentation among many, albeit admittedly a significant one." And in another sense, another quote, it's "I distance myself from Marx's attempt to locate the penultimate essence of law and link it to the penultimate essence of capitalism." So there's a certain kind of modesty here, which is what I want to do in the book, or what Dina is doing in the book, is mapping a certain set of argumentative patterns. And I think that's fine. Dina and I have proved we don't have to agree to be able to do things productively. But I do think that even if Dina doesn't want to wholesale adopt the glorious gospel of Pashikanis, there is, on the other hand, a certain conflict between the achievements of the book and the modesty with which the book sets them out, which to me would require some further level of theoretical articulation. So why do I say this? Well, what I say is that one of the absolutely brilliant things about the book, right, is that it maps the emergence, prevalence, and consistency of this argument across a whole host of historical periods. Now, Dina obviously is not saying this exhausts all the mechanisms through which international law might promote or not promote capitalism, but it's clearly there. And it's clearly importantly there, right, in the context also of the Iraq stuff, where it is look, even after the death of this formal language, this stuff comes up. So a big question that we might want to ask then, right, is, okay, so we've got this idea about a structure of argument, but how do we account for why this argument became so important and so prevalent in international legal discourse? Because a liberal or a crit, to save themselves from some of your thing, might say, and this is what Tony Angie occasionally does, this was a purely contingent encounter between a group of lawyers and a language of civilization, which then, because of its consequences, stayed embedded in the law. So there's an initial contingent thing, and then it's just like a certain kind of logic of, I can't think of the word now, but the fact that things like to stay in the same place, inertia, that's the word I'm looking for, keeps that in place. But then the point about that might be, you might just be like, so if we just got rid of all the bad international lawyers and got the good international lawyers in and stopped using this structure, everything would be great. Now, I know that that's not what Dina wants to do, but what this suggests, right, is that we need an account on some level of why, if this was the logic of capitalism being expressed or reflected, why law was particularly primed to do that, why it did it so deeply. Now, I think this is the important point. There are points in the book where that is clearly beginning to be outlined, but I would want to hear more of. So first, there's the mention of Althusser and ideology. And so maybe this is an account of law as an ideology in the Althusserian sense. Great, but I need to hear more about that. And then I would also be like, Althusser does understand that there is something specific about law's role in capitalist ideology, which marks law out as quite distinct. He thinks that the birth of the subject is linked to juridical reasoning, right? The second point is another thing that comes up is this idea of the class position of international lawyers. So because they occupy a particular role in an international class structure, they are primed to reproduce certain language. I can kind of see that, although I find that argument in some senses less convincing because, of course, when you then factor in, as Dina herself will do and does understand, the role of different lawyers in relation to different movements, in relation to expressing different political antagonisms, it becomes hard to explain on that context, you know, why certain lawyers are able to mount their arguments more successfully than others. So I think we need some kind of an account of what the affinity between international law and this capitalist logic is, which obviously for me would be like, this is where we have Patricanus, but I would want to hear more about that in what Dina is doing. And I've got like 2 minutes left, I think, because I've been talking too long. So I will just quickly go through this point. My second point is I want to think very briefly about the idea of law as a text and this idea of deconstruction. And I really think that this deconstruction point is in some respects a low-key magisterial achievement of the book, because Dina is like the first person that's ever made me think maybe I should take deconstruction a little bit more seriously than I'm actually ever going to do. That's great, that's big. And I think this is really important, but I want to push back slightly, or at least have us think a little bit about what this might mean, right? And some of this might be just my lack of an understanding of what we mean by texts. But at one point, Dina kind of contrasts the idea of law as text and this idea of law as magic. And this is taken from other people, obviously. And the idea of magic as well. Law follows these rituals, these procedures, all this kind of stuff. And I think in some ways this contrast is really brilliant. But obviously one thing that is also really important, well, there are two things that are important. Firstly, law isn't just grand arguments. It's also a thing that plays out in like messy, grubby, dirty ways, in the ways in which administrators do stuff, in like low-key conflicts, in the way that my employer is like going to screw me over in the midst of a strike or whatever. So law is both this grand textual argument, but also this. And so partly what I want to hear is a mediation on those different moments. But the other thing is, and I think this is kind of flipped back again, within the book, what we get is a series of really well-connected different instances of the juridical. And I'd want to hear more about if they all have the same status. Obvious thing that I would just flag up, not in the book, but an example is the ICJ can say one thing in Nicaragua in the USA, but then the US in the Security Council can basically mean that that judgment is never rendered. Both of these are clearly examples of the juridical, and they're both undergirded by a set of international legal readings. But one is arguably in some ways less textual than the other. And if they're not, is there some kind of difference in which we could think of that kind of thing? And I think that's really important, and this is the final point. I could say more, but I'm rambling and going over, because if we look in the context of somewhere like, let's look at what's happening in Gaza today. That is also the law in action, right? That is like every military targeting decision is at least in part undergirded by a sense of this is a legal reasoning thing that's been decided in this way and in this way and in this way. So part of my question then is, and this is partly just because I maybe don't get deconstruction, but I think it's also important to like unpack a little bit. Like, what does it mean to talk about law as a text when it is also interwoven with and moving with those things? And what then is the relationship between the grander arguments and practice and pans and this kind of grubbier field that's going on? But I'll just finish there and say once again, great book. If you haven't bought it, you should buy it or at least download the PDF illegally. It is really circulating around a lot. But definitely do. And thanks everyone for that.
Thank you, Rob. I think one of the biggest compliments that you can pay to any author, but particularly to the author of a book which is so much about reading, is to have given such a proper, close, careful reading. I think that's a really wonderful thing. Lucia, do go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tanzil, Eva, and Isabel for inviting me. And well, thanks, Dina, for writing this book. I also wanted to start by expressing my solidarity to the Palestinian people and my full support for the general strike today. About this book, I agree, it's a very important book that looks beyond the apparent indeterminacy of legal arguments and tries to link them to the logic of capitalist imperialism. And this embeddedness of the law within this global system, as Dina and Rob have already explained, leads to this continuous oscillation between a developmental and a racist logic. And I think that the book does a good job in highlighting the link between capitalism, classical political economy, and the law, but I'm not sure that its method of symptomatic reading really reveals all dimensions of these antagonisms. In particular, Dina argues that the invisibility of labor, I'm quoting, so within the classical political economists, was the result of the problematic that the classical political economy was posing. So this invisibility of labor was the result of the structure of the theory. But my question is, were the classical economists unable to find the origin of surplus value in labor exploitation because they were trapped within a certain problematic or because of their class interest? And this is linked to the question whether the logic of civilization is necessarily trapped within these polar opposites of improvement and biology. If we look at the Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, for example, we see that the division of labor for Adam Smith allows the progress in both freedom and prosperity on the one side for all nations in the world, but all this division of labor is also the basis of what I'm quoting, the European superiority over the African savages. So in order to understand this contradiction within Smith, we need to bear in mind a few things. First, that Smith is probably the first who posits the problematic of labor as the origin of value, and this pushes him to recognize that profits derive from unpaid labor, and also that competition on the world market favors capital in the more developed countries, which also profit from their colonies. So in Smith, from my point of view, we do find the rudimentary theory of labor exploitation and also the resulting degradation of labor of the workers. And this theory is linked to an analysis of the antagonisms that shape the world market. But it's because of the class interest of Smith that Smith doesn't systematically develop these elements within his theory and instead naturalizes the bourgeois horizon. And for Marx, as a result of this, Europe was presented as the height of civilization, and bourgeois relations, I'm quoting, were quietly smuggled in as the inviolable natural laws of society in the abstract. So pre-capitalist societies were judged against these parameters of civilization. And this naturalizing logic is closely linked to the myth of primitive accumulation. So the idea that a diligent and frugal elite accumulated wealth through their labor and saving, while while a lazy and improvident majority ended up having nothing to sell except their own skin. So what we see here is that the language of equality and exchange, as Dina argues, hides the antagonisms that shape the global system, and this leads to the naturalizations of inequalities caused by this system, both at the national level and internationally. But if this kind of conceptual framework is not the result of the problematic that is inherent in the classical political economy theory, but it's an expression of the class struggle in the theory itself, then I think we need to push ourselves more to look systematically and think about the relationship between theory and praxis. I'm not going to bore you too much with my reading of Marx's Capital and Imperialism, but I believe that if the myth of primitive accumulation plays a key role, not just in the original genesis of the system, but also in its reproduction, so does the chapter on primitive, the part on primitive accumulation in Capital, in which Marx dispels such myths and shows what's behind these myths. So not only the violent initial accumulation of capital on a world scale, but also how capital and the states respond to the processes of labor cooperation, which are at the basis of value production, and the fact that this cooperation lays the basis for the conscious organizations of the working class, and also what he calls the expropriation of the expropriators. And I think it's also important to bear in mind the global dimension of this analysis of accumulation and the way in which Marx himself integrates imperialism into this analysis in order to understand that the part on primitive accumulation describes the permanent role played by imperial states in particular that try and avoid the coming together of workers' movements and anti-colonial struggles. And this leads me to my third point. So what's beyond Western civilization, which I think it's an important question we should ask. So if we look at Marx himself, we see that in the manifesto, for example, Marx and Engels celebrated the civilizing function of the bourgeoisie. And this has been widely criticized, and I agree, this reflects a narrow view of the revolution focused on Europe. But this kind of celebration is also aimed at expressing the contradictions of capitalism and its revolutionary potential. And what we see if we look at the development of Marxist theory is that the deepening of his understanding of imperialism and of the racialized stratifications that it creates among workers pushed Marx to abandon the explicit language of civilization even before what Eric Hobsbawm called the Age of Empire, and George Mosse, the process of nationalization of the masses in Europe. And this leads me to two further theoretical points. First, the naturalizing logic of capitalism doesn't necessarily imply a biological logic, because if we look at the classical economists, for example, we don't find racism at the center of that discourse. In order to understand why civilization as a term became loaded with a racist and also biological logic, we need to go beyond the problematic and look at the attempts by the imperial ruling classes to basically weaken the international organization of the working class, especially in a period in which there was an rising anti-colonial uprising in the rest of the world. But even today, I think biological arguments are not exclusive, and we also need to look at the importance, for example, of culturalist, racist arguments, like, for example, if we look at Islamophobia. And it's also in response to this kind of transformations that were taking place in front of his eyes that Marx abandoned the language of civilization. And since the 70s, his studies became more focused on world history, pre-capitalist societies, and also the condition of women in history. And I think it's interesting to look, for example, at his historical ethnological notebooks, because they cover exactly the period that you discussed, so the late 19th century. And in these notebooks, Marx explicitly rejects the racial theories, racial categories, and also uses a series of ethnographers, like, for example, Morgan and Bachhofen and so on, to undermine the arguments advanced by Henry Summer Maine and others. And, for example, ridicule the view that the patriarchal family was the original form of the family, and denouncing how imperialist interests projected forms of despotism into primitive institutions in order to naturalize these forms of despotism. So from my point of view, in the end of his life, Marx felt the need to conceptualize, on the one side, the richness of forms of resistance to the global expansion of capitalism, but also to conceptualize the civilizational alternative to capitalism in richer cultural terms. So in this light, I like to ask 3 questions, more contemporary questions. So if we look, for example, that also reflects your periodization somehow. If we look at Lenin's 1913 article, Backward Europe and Advanced Asia, for example, we see that Lenin is trying to reverse the language of civilization from a revolutionary point of view. And so I must admit, I didn't read your article on the Baku Congress yet, but it's on my desktop. So yours and actually Rod's. So to what extent, from your point of view, did Lenin, the Third International, and the Baku Congress of the Peoples of the East play a role in shifting the post-1919 debate, including Wilson's principle of self-determination and the approach of the League of Nations? My second question is, at some point, you argued that the colonized chose to mobilize international law to varying degrees and with different levels of commitment in order to fight against their oppression. So does this really capture the variety of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist approaches within the anti-colonial movement? And my final question concerns the chapter on Iraq, because I'm not sure I understood you correctly, but you seem to argue that it is more important to understand how post-occupation reforms in Iraq enacted this logic of civilization rather than discussing whether they were legal or not, and that the majority of legal scholars wasn't really interested in doing this. Well, I must say that I would disagree with this approach, because even if like referring to international law shouldn't be at the center of our critique, I think it's still an important aspect, including today. So if we want to denounce Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinian territories, or its the war crimes that is committing right now while we speak. I also think that the logic of improvement and biology doesn't fully capture the developments in post-occupation Iraq, and in particular, the ways in which the occupiers responded to the kind of unified Iraqi resistance by creating religious and sectarian divisions in all institutions that they created in Iraq. And so I wanted to ask you how this fits within your kind of framework, because it wasn't covered in the book, and so I'm curious to hear about it. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucia. And again, I think one of the really nice compliments that readers pay is you know, say more, because I think it's wonderful, the idea that books open up more discussion rather than having the last word. So Dina, please do, if you would like to, respond to what Rob and Lucia have said.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much. And again, thanks for such generous and close and generative readings. I'm actually really, really grateful to both of you. I mean, there were so many points raised. I'll try to like pick some, and then maybe we can go to questions from the audience, and then I can come back to that. I mean, I will try to defend a little bit Derrida, or at least the deconstructive approach in light of what Rob said. And I think that also responds a little bit to the question that Lucia raises, but about whether we should talk about legality or not, or illegality. So the way I understand it, and interestingly, I think Kanat Bakchi is also in the call, who raised very, very similar points in a review that is forthcoming to the issues Rob did. And I'm basically going to repeat what I'm going to say in my response there, which is, so basically, I'm just using deconstruction to say, you know, almost a point that is very commonplace in critical international law, which is like, the texts do not correspond to anything. The texts, they don't correspond to some rules, pristine rules that exist in some sort of Platonic universe outside these texts, and we have to like clean up the texts to find the rules that these texts correspond. The texts correspond to themselves. That's it. There is no pure, like, it's a very, very simple point about, like, you know, the non-existence of pure transmission that makes the text corresponding to nothing other than themselves. In law, I think what you're saying they do not correspond to is to some legal rules or legal principles that somehow exist somewhere and we need to find them. There is no such thing, or at least you can say that there is for the sake of convenience, for example, for the sake sometimes of anti-imperialist convenience, or you can say that some things are slightly more plausible to say than others, but that's about it. So that's the way I use it, right? I don't use it to make claims that reality doesn't exist, which no one of the interesting people in deconstruction ever said. This, though, does not answer what I think is truly the very interesting part of your question, which is, what about, you know, the mundane practices of implementation and administration and contestation and whatever that build some sort of links nonetheless between texts and things that happen in factories and in war zones and in the street and whatever. I think I say that in the introduction. I'm a little bit wary, and I potentially took that 2 steps too far. I'm a little bit wary of the tendency, especially of critical lawyers, to say that the world has been willed into existence by international law, which is a truly extravagant thing to believe, that only, like, it somehow creates us the loyal opposition, right? Only lawyers could possibly believe something so bizarre. However, I think it is possible to say that, you know, somehow these texts are linked to material practices through, or material realities through processes of mediation, especially bureaucracy, right? My answer to that is that neither I nor most international lawyers that I know are social legally trained enough to make robust claims about how these connections happen. Like, I think in a sense that's a question of method, right? That my answer would be, I think you could make claims about this, but you need some sort of robust materialist social legal method that I don't think most people who make claims about what law does have or employ. And that's where I get a little bit jumpy. And there's people who do that, right? And historically, Marxists have done that. Like, Marxist feminists in law and development have done fantastic social, legal, and empirical work in showing how these rules enter into circulation and the bizarre things that happen to them when they enter into circulation. But I'm a little bit, I have possibly become a little bit too wary, because I think in the effort to say that law is complicit, in critical lawyers, and especially critical international lawyers who are also a bit anxious to show that we are relevant, have ended up making insane claims about causality. That I don't think property as a real phenomenon is entirely reducible to law. I think it's also reducible to practices of administration, to practices of private ordering, to practices of illegal and extra legal discipline of violence, and also to law to an extent. So that would be, I think that would be my answer, and I hope like that does tackle your concern. And obviously that was a little bit of an answer to one of Lucia's point. So partly I refrain from making calls about legality and illegality about Iraq, because also these points have been rehearsed to death, right? Like, sure, should I be another person who in 2020 relitigates the legality of the Iraq war? Is that really needed? I don't think it is. However, and that takes me back to law as an argumentative practice rather than as a collection of rules. Can we also say with huge certainty that all these things they did were illegal? Again, first I would say no, because I have already got rid of that, because I'm saying there aren't rules outside the text. The texts are the point. The discussion and the argumentative practice is the point. They don't correspond to anything. But let's say I suspend this for a second, and let's say they do correspond to something. I would be really wary to say that every single thing that the Coalition Provisional Authority did in Iraq after 2003 were all of them unambiguously illegal. I think some of these things, even their own lawyers did think they were illegal, especially things of like outright privatization. But my whole point is that like some of these provisions, they're not just indeterminate in a very deep structural level, they're literally indeterminate, because if I tell you you cannot reform things, you can only reform things if it has to do with like public security and human rights, if you genuinely believe, and if you in 2003 and many other things believe that too, that a free market, a particular form of free market, is essential to the realization of human rights, which in 2003 was a very defensible position. I didn't agree with it, but it was a position many people held. When you're sitting down to do legal interpretation, it's not so straightforward that every single thing that happened was illegal. And I think, unfortunately, the same thing applies like to Israel and Gaza, right? Like Israel is very eager to speak the language of international law. And I think like that, like if you go to like the Twitter of the IDF, they talk international law the whole time, because I think it does enable you to make some of these arguments. And for example, you could still say that many of the things that happen are absolutely illegal, but for example, settler colonialism is not illegal in international law. Occupation is, but settler colonialism isn't. And that raises questions about the way Palestinians have been talking about the situation. And this is not a situation that only involves the occupied territories. This is not even a language that only involves the discriminatory laws within the 48 Palestine. It's an overarching framework of settler colonialism that international law cannot capture, because that is not its job. Actually, it's here to authorize practices of settler colonialism. So that's part of the reason why, well, and a bunch of reasons why I'm quite wary to start saying that things are legal or illegal. Yes, the other point was about religious divisions and Iraq. And now I will have to repeat what I said a bit earlier, which is I'm not making claims, overarching claims about the way in which the occupying power governed Iraq as a whole, right? I'm making claims about the sort of legal arguments they made in order to justify some of the things they were doing. And in the arguments they made to justify some of the things they were doing, what they understood as religious extremism or factionalism or whatever did exist. It was used as part of what I would say was the logic of biology. Because partly, and Lucia is not the first person to raise this point, I think the logic of biology ended up being a little bit misleading. when I say logic of biology, I mean logic of immutable difference. Is just slightly less catchy. I don't think it reads really nicely. When I say logic of biology, I don't only refer to hardcore biological racism or to hardcore biological sexism, right? I refer to constellations, ideological constellations of explain or grounding supposedly immutable difference. And I would be inclined to say that with the exception of a terrifically narrow strain of really committed biological racists, even in the 19th century, immutable difference was itself always grounded in a mixture of measuring people's heads, religion, and what we would call culture, right? And in a sense, that takes me back to the structure of my argument, which was not accepting private property, like actively rejecting private property, at some point became such a marker of like that you're degenerate that we almost assume there must be something biologically wrong with you, because who in their right mind would reject property and contract? So I think, like, in a sense, it's worth, and I assume some responsibility for using the words logic of biology, but I think I did try to make a little bit clear that I mean logic of immutable difference, and the particular registers in which this logic of immutable difference expresses itself are contingent, and they're also a bit messy, and they change over time. And the mix between full-on measuring of scales, religion and culture, the proportions between these things, I think they're subject to change, and they're subject, of course, to bring it back to Lucia, also to the struggles of those who find themselves in the receiving ends, right? At some point, it was the struggles of those who were racialized or who were gendered that made the overt measuring of skulls or measuring of pelvises slightly unacceptable. And to finish again with Lucia's point about the Baku conference, but also more broadly about the effect of the Soviet Union here. So as you say, we have a piece with Rob that came out earlier this year that actually discusses this in some detail, but I will focus specifically on civilization rather than more broadly on the effect of the Soviet Union and of Leninism and international law. So one huge thing the Soviets did after 1945, together with the emerging post-colonial movements, was to make the explicit language of civilization unacceptable. So the decline of explicit usages, you can trace it in a very straightforward way to the Soviet Union. So in 1945, after 1945, when they were discussing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, France actually wanted to introduce the language of civilization in the Universal Declaration. And if you read like the Travaux, like the Soviet got totally apoplectic and they had to take it out. Or the first times in which the ICJ mentions Article 38, it takes out the word civilized, is Judge Krylov, like the Soviet judge, already since the late 1940s, in which without much explanation, but he stops using the word civilized even when he's quoting Article 38. So I would say they had a profound impact in making the usage of the word taboo. And I think, I mean, even though I'm saying that the argumentative structure persists, I think it was important that it became not very polite to say it. Like, it did show that there was an effort to change things. But to the extent I don't read Russian, so my answer is going to be limited. to the extent that I know and I have seen, they did not necessarily try to always to deal with the underlying argumentative structure. An exception again to that, but without very good argumentation, is, and that's very detailed, but it's the position of the Soviet judge in the South of West Africa, first advisory opinion, which I think was like extremely interesting and extremely underappreciated, but I'm going to stop here.
Thanks, Dina. Well, there's already one question in the chat, and if you would like to, if you're shy and you don't want to say your question out loud, then please do put your questions in the chat. But otherwise, if you would like to ask a question, you can use the hands up function, which you can find under the reactions button, in case you're having trouble locating it. So please, people with questions, do ask them. Nicole Stribarovna has written a question in the chat. Nicole, would you like to ask your question out loud?
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I already put the question in the chat, so I can reread it. I also read Tina's book introduction yet, but looking forward to read more. So yeah, I was just wondering, in reaction to your PowerPoint, as you kind of strongly reflected Martti Koskenniemi's work, and he's my colleague here in Helsinki, so I had quite some conversations with him throughout the time. I was wondering if you could perhaps stress again how your two concepts differ from his two concepts of the structural indeterminacy of the argument, and then also how does your importation of the economic rationale differs from his into the argument bias? Thanks. It's a great book and great presentation. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. That, like, I read it there. That's a fantastic question, and thank you for asking it. So Marx's argument, to begin with, it hinges on international law as a liberal project rather than as a capitalist project, right? And I think the difference there is big for a number of reasons. First, in a very traditional Marxist account, I would say, I think explaining an argumentative structure, which is international law, based on another argumentative structure, which is liberalism, simply displaces the problem one step further. And actually, as a lawyer, it displaces it in a field that you understand possibly less than in law. So in a sense, I have a problem there with constantly displacing argumentative structures. Is it like turtles all the way down? It might be turtles all the way down, but it feels to me like it displaces the problem in a way that obviously I find productive, but on that point, I don't find particularly productive. Secondly, this hinges on an idea of international law as a liberal project that I think is a little bit overstated. I think it ignores ideological diversity within international law, including the fact that many 19th century international lawyers, they were not liberals, even by a long stretch of imagination. And I'm not saying that to defend liberalism, right? Lorimer was not a liberal. Whatever your definition of liberalism was, he was not one. And therefore, what I find personally interesting is that Westlake, who was a liberal reformer and pro-women's suffrage, ends up gendering the state or sexing the state in a very similar way than Lorimer or Bütschli, who were reactionaries even for their time. And my question is why? Why do these people who find themselves at opposing ends of domestic politics, and one side of which is not liberal, why do they nonetheless end up using very similar argumentative structures, even if their mix between improvement and biology is different? And again, that takes me to, there has to be something outside discourse, outside the structure of liberalism or conservatism. And there I say that might be because international law reflects a material reality rather than yet another discursive system, which is liberalism. And the third part of that would be that this is 2021, this is not 1991. And liberalism is not the only, or it's not even the game in town, right? I feel that critiquing international law as a liberal project has missed a little bit the moment there. Both in terms of neoliberalism, that I think is distinct to liberalism, both as an ideology and as a mode of capitalist accumulation, but also in terms of forms of authoritarian capitalism that are on the rise both within and outside the West. So in a sense, I think that it would also be a little bit missing what is going on if we kept banging on about liberalism. You're just kicking somebody who's down, in a sense. And that also takes me to your question specifically about apology and utopia, which is, yeah, I mean, in a sense, I think his dyad is extremely different to mine. Including, literally what the dyad entails, right? His entails has to do with the grounding of legal obligation, whereas mine has to do with what civilization means, or what civilization entails rather than means. This is not a humanitic project. So I hope this kind of answers the question. Thank you.
Thanks, Dina. Any other questions? Everybody's being very reticent, but please do put your hand up if you do have a question. So just under that reactions button is the hands up function. But, oh yes, lovely. Kanad, go ahead.
Right, thank you very much, really. And I'm sorry that I have to switch off my camera for the moment. There's a lot that is happening in the background. Well, Dina, again, thanks so much. I think this is like the third or the fourth book, book presentation that I'm listening to. But as Rob said, I mean, there's every time I attend it, there's something new that I learn. So that's fantastic. And obviously, I have a question. I mean, I think Rob already hinted at that, and I'm not going to ask you the question, Pashakan, because I want to reserve that for day after tomorrow when you're at Heidelberg for your talk. But so my question, it's not really a question, but I do want to sort of ask you if you want to think about the standard of civilization from a global class approach. I mean, this is something that you haven't, I think, at least explicitly done in the book. And so your thesis is a Marxist thesis, and it's a historical materialist thesis, and you justify that really well. But there was this class element that I was also thinking might be extremely productive for us to know a little more about. So if you can think about standard of civilization from a global class and a continuing class struggle aspect, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kanad. And I think I said it earlier, Kanad has written a fantastic review of my book, slightly better than the book itself. And you should read it when it comes out. Yes, class and global class perspective. So the point of the book, in which I do talk a little bit about class, but it's not a very serious analysis, and I agree with you, is in trying to understand why and how the standard of civilization was embraced so quickly and so successfully by peripheral and semi-peripheral international lawyers, right? And what I'm trying to say there is, listen, on the one hand, they did push back against some aspects of the standard of civilization, and especially the most overt biological aspects of it, right? And especially in the who decides bit, global South lawyers, or peripheral, semi-peripheral lawyers, not to be anachronistic, were always like, we are deciding. It is up to us and not to Western international lawyers to say if we have attained civilized status. The flip side of that, I say, was that in adopting the standard of civilization, even when contesting aspects of it, peripheral and semi-peripheral international lawyers were making basically they were promoting their own projects of domestic capitalist and consolidation and also bureaucratic consolidation, right? So in a sense, the language of civilization was very important to them as a class and also as organic intellectuals of classes. So both aspects of it, both they established themselves as a class, which Western international lawyers also did, established themselves as a particular category of organic intellectual of capital that has the peculiar position of being an intellectual both of your domestic capital and of transnational capital. And peripheral and semi-peripheral international lawyers did a very similar move. And they anchored their incorporation of civilization into their own domestic projects of capitalist transformation and state centralization. And what you see is within like 20 years at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, this language being incorporated and then being transformed and redeployed against domestic enemies. Suddenly, if you're a tribe in the north of 19th, early 20th century Siam, you're specifically uncivilized. Or if you are both within and outside the West, if you're working class, you're civilized. Bluntschli was very clear that the working class is an enemy of civilization in these words. So in a sense, I would say the class question would make us think as international lawyers, both as a class in ourselves, a class of organic intellectuals, but also as representatives of particular domestic and occasionally international projects of capitalist transformation. And yeah, I don't do this in any terribly systematic way, but one of the things I was slightly wary about in the literature of international law the last 7 years is a slight lionization of peripheral and semi-peripheral international lawyers. And Rob has written a lot about, how there were two strands within post-colonial international lawyers, but I think I got a little bit jumpy when I started seeing Greek international lawyers being presented as some sort of like, and I'm talking about Greek because that's the bit I feel comfortable to say bad things about, being presented as some sort of anti-imperialist agents. And I was like, I know these people, that really doesn't sound true. Wanting to improve the position of your country in the imperialist chain is not exactly an anti-imperialist project. So yeah, I hope this answers your question.
Thanks, Tina. We have another question in the chat from Rui Marquez Pinto. Would you like to ask your own question?
Hi, good afternoon. My question is regarding solidarity, because this is a concept they've been for a while been discussing in the level from international law also. And my question is if solidarity can be a mechanism to solve any kind of disputes in the level from international law. We see the questions about between Israel and Palestinian, for example. Yeah, this is my what I'm reflecting right now, and if it's possible to implement some kind of framework that that this kind of dispute could be solved on a human, better way, without war. This is what I mean.
Sure, thank you, Rui. So my answer to that would be a slight dodging of the question. In a sense, I wrote a whole book to say that civilization means nothing. And I feel, or it's an argumentative structure, is not a coherent concept. And for this, that has given me a certain instinct to say that solidarity and sovereignty and all these things, there might be value to also approach them in the same light, right? Instead of saying that solidarity, means something transparent, which I really suspect that it doesn't. I think the more interesting question there would be, what sort of arguments are anchored to the language of solidarity, and what sort of practices are authorized through the language of solidarity, right? Because you can find, again, I'll go to Rob's work, you can find, in the decolonization period, radical understandings of solidarity, and especially like Bajawi would be the source of that. You can find also the European Union's understanding of what is solidarity, which is austerity to death in Southern Europe. These seem to me quite different visions of what solidarity means. So in a sense, I would say, if I have something to offer, which I don't think I have much to offer, but I have much more to offer a method than to offer an answer. And the method would be, as I said before, what sort of arguments hinge on solidarity and what sort of practices are authorized. And it might again be because I'm Greek, but I get a little bit jumpy about the uses of solidarity the last 10 to 15 years.
Thanks, Tina. As always happens, as people sort of relax, lots more questions are coming in, which is wonderful. But I think that that Lucia would like to follow up. So I'm going to give Lucia the floor now to ask a question back.
No, I was just wondering if we would get back to you in the end. Well, I just wanted to go back to the question of Iraq, right, and the occupation authority. So my understanding is that the occupiers were fully aware that the vast majority of the Iraqi people were against the liberalizing reforms that the occupiers wanted to implement. And that's why they tried to impose them as soon as possible before organizing free elections, which would have allowed Iraqi people to express their views. And in my understanding, of course, this is always the law. I'm not a lawyer, and I must say that I don't base my criticisms on international law. So it's not really the center of my critique. But my understanding is that because of the Hague Resolution, this is how they proceeded in order to impose this. So does this matter today? The other thing I think we should say is that in these liberalizing measures, which according to Naomi Klein and others were basically, in comparison to them, the shock therapy in the USSR was basically a spa therapy. So it was an extreme measure of liberalization. They also basically discriminated against Iraqi and said that you can't even bid for reconstruction bids and stuff like that. So these were directly discriminatory. So does this matter today? Well, I would say yes, it does matter if we want to discuss about the occupation. I think that many of our students, for example, I teach this, they don't know anything about it. They learn war studies. They are not told about this kind of stuff. They are not told about the consequences of these kind of reforms on the Iraqi people and why the Iraqi now are on the streets, in the squares, trying to reverse this kind of sectarianism and neoliberalism and so on. And also my question is, are we giving up seeing Tony Blair on trial for his war crimes? So saying that we don't care whether this was legal or not. So in my understanding, at the Congress of Nuremberg, the Nazis were sentenced to death also because of the Hague resolution about what can happen or not under occupation. Are we giving up seeing Tony Blair, Bush, and all the other people responsible, including Biden, who is the kind of architect of the sectarian division of Iraq? Are we giving up seeing these people on trial? Or are we basically just saying we need to wait till the socialist revolution and then justice will come?
Yeah,
so I'm really upset. I'm upset because of the situation, not because of you, just the situation. I'm really upset right now, sorry.
I mean, I personally believe that the chances of the socialist revolution coming first, like, I think that it's like, if you want to actually make a discussion about pragmatic strategy, I think the socialist revolution is actually a more likely thing to happen than seeing Tony Blair on trial. Like, actually, if you want to make it a question of tactics, I don't think it's going to happen. Like, I'm telling you, it's not. So you can like move on with your life. Does it matter that it was illegal? It didn't prevent it at the time to begin with. And at the time there was anyone went on The Guardian and said it was illegal, right? Like, if I also say, James Crawford said it, does it matter if I will say it too? I don't think it does, because I don't think I'm more important than James Crawford. Everyone said it. The other aspect to these, jokes aside, was the point some of these people who went to The Guardian made, and the point China Mieville also made after this, which was in the process, a certain reification of international legality took place that made the violence of the US in Haiti, or I would tell you subsequently, the violence of the US in Libya, a little bit more difficult to criticize, because at least aspects of it were legal. The US intervention, we can discuss whether they went far or whether they didn't, or whether they violated the resolution. The US, like the NATO bombing of Libya, was legal. I don't know, I think I can still criticize it. So that's one bit. And the other bit would be, if your desire is to see Tony Blair on trial, I don't think it's going to happen. So like I don't know why necessarily I should base my analysis on something that is genuinely less likely than the socialist revolution.
Thanks, Dina. It's a big question for all of us international lawyers, I think, and a difficult one to respond to, particularly in a situation like we have today. We've run way past our time, which is completely understandable with such an interesting book and such fantastic comments from Rob Knox and from Lucia Pradella. Thank you, both commentators, very much. Thank you, Dina, for writing a wonderful book and for being here in your evening. I mean, you know, it's in the middle of the day for us, but evening time for you. Thank you very much. And thank you to Tanzil and Ava for organising the event. And please do watch out for other events in their series, which will be the Law and Marxism series, which will be forthcoming. Thank you all very much for coming. Bye.